The restraints on my wrists were not designed for human anatomy. I could tell because whoever built them had assumed 4 fingers, not 5, and the 5th finger on each hand was being pressed at an angle that made my eyes water. I did not call out. I did not ask where I was. I already knew I was not on Earth, because Earth did not have gravity that pulled slightly sideways. And Earth did not smell like cold copper and something faintly sweet like overripe fruit left in a warm room. I am Dr. Cale Morrow. I am 39 years old. I am a xenoarchaeologist, which means I spend my life studying artifacts from civilizations I have never met, drawing conclusions from broken pottery and burned records and the shapes of rooms in abandoned structures. I am, by every professional standard, a man who deals in silence and patience and the slow work of understanding things from a distance. None of that prepared me for waking up on an alien ship. The room was not a cell exactly, it was round, with walls that gave off a faint blue light from somewhere deep inside them, the way ice sometimes glows when sunlight passes through it. The floor was smooth and warm under my bare feet. There were no sharp edges anywhere. Everything about the space felt carefully considered, as if someone had thought very hard about how not to cause discomfort, and had also thought hard about how to make absolutely sure I could not leave. There were 3 of them in the room with me when I finally looked up. They were tall. 2 of them stood at what I guessed was about 7 feet, though their proportions were different from a human's. Their torsos were longer, their legs slightly shorter, and they had no visible neck. Their heads simply continued from their shoulders as a smooth, widening column that ended in 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line, each one amber-colored and perfectly still. They wore something that looked like layered fabric, the color of deep water, and they stood with their hands clasped in front of them in a gesture that felt oddly familiar, like a greeting or a prayer. The 3rd one was smaller, close to my height. It had the same general structure as the other 2 but moved differently, with a kind of careful precision that made me think of a surgeon. It was the one holding a small rectangular device, and when it saw that I was looking at it, it pressed a single spot on the device with one long finger. A voice came out of the device. It spoke in English, not perfect English, good English. Dr. Morrow, we are relieved that you are conscious. Please do not be alarmed. I looked at the restraints on my wrists. I looked at the round, sealed room with no visible door. I looked at 3 beings I had never seen in any database, on any page, in any file that humanity had ever produced, because as far as humanity knew, we were alone in the universe. Sure, I said. The small one tilted its head. The motion was so human that it unsettled me more than anything else had. We understand this is disorienting. We will explain what we can. Where am I? Aboard the retrieval vessel Solana Cord. We are currently traveling at low speed, approximately 14 light minutes from the boundary. I sat with that for a moment. The boundary. I knew what boundary they meant, because I had spent 6 years studying it. The seal, we called it on Earth. A spherical field of energy that surrounded our entire solar system, detectable by its faint gravitational signature, and by the way, certain deep space probes simply stopped transmitting when they reached it, not with an error, but with a clean, finished silence, as if they had decided there was nothing more to say. No one on Earth had been able to determine what it was, where it came from, or how old it was. The best estimate from our best scientists was that it had been in place for at least 10,000 years. I had crossed it. That was why I was here. My research vessel, the Caro, had been testing a new field disruption model at the very edge of the seal. We had not expected it to work. I had not expected to wake up on the other side of the universe's oldest mystery with alien restraints on my hands and 3 beings staring at me, with what I was slowly beginning to recognize as nervousness. You pulled me through? I asked. We detected the breach and responded immediately. The small one said, You were in distress, your vessel was damaged. The rest of my crew? A pause. Just a fraction of a second too long. They are safe. Your crew remained on your side of the boundary. Only your capsule crossed the threshold. I believed them. I was not sure why, but I did. Maybe because lying to me served no obvious purpose, and they had gone to some effort to make me comfortable, including what I noticed now was a small cup of water sitting on a ledge near my left hand, placed there deliberately, within easy reach. I drank the water. It tasted like water. That, more than anything, made me feel slightly better. What's your name? I asked the small one. It made a sound first, something between a hum and a click, and then the device translated it. As you may call me Elra. It is not precisely my name, but it is the closest your phonetics allow. All right, Elra. I looked at the other 2. And them? They are my seniors. They do not speak to you directly. Not yet. I noticed for the first time that the 2 tall ones had not moved at all since I woke up. Not a single shift of weight, not a blink, Not a breath I could detect. They were staring at me with their 4 amber eyes each, perfectly still, and there was something in that stillness that made the hair on my arms rise. Not because it was threatening, because it looked like how a person stands when they are trying very hard not to run. Are they afraid of me? I asked. Elra's 4 eyes moved in a way that might have been a flinch. That is a complicated question, Dr. Morrow. Try a simple answer. The small alien was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then it said something that I have thought about every single day since. All senior members of the conclave are afraid of you, not of you personally, of what you represent, of what has returned. It paused. There is a phrase we use. It translates roughly as the ember must not spread. It is the oldest active directive in conclave law. It was written 12,000 years ago. It was written because of your world. I looked at the 2 tall, motionless beings who could not make themselves look away from me, even though every signal their bodies were sending said they wanted to. I thought about all the years I had spent studying artifacts that never quite fit any known pattern, ruins on moons that our telescopes could barely reach, signals that our instruments picked up for a few seconds and then never again. I had always assumed the silence of the universe meant we were alone. I was beginning to understand that the silence had been deliberate. You didn't seal Earth away because we were dangerous, I said slowly, working it out as I spoke. Did you? Elra's device made a soft sound before it translated its next words, as if even the machine needed a moment. No, it said. Not in the way you mean. We sealed you away because we did not know what else to do with you. And because we were afraid that if we did nothing, there would be nothing left of us to be afraid. Outside the circular room, through a material in the wall that was either glass or something that behaved like it, I could see stars. They were the same stars I had looked at from Earth my whole life. They looked exactly the same from here. That was the strangest part. The universe had not changed, only my place in it had. I sat back against the warm wall and looked at Elra and its 2 silent, terrified seniors, and I said the most professional, composed, scientifically rigorous thing I could manage given the circumstances. You're going to need to start from the beginning. Elra looked at me for a long moment. Yes, it said. We suspected you would say that. One of the tall ones made a sound then. The first sound either of them had produced. It was low and resonant, and Elra's device did not translate it. But Elra turned to look at it, and then turned back to me, and said something I did not expect. They want me to tell you that they are grateful you are well, and that they are sorry. For all of it. I did not know what all of it meant yet, but the way both tall figures lowered their heads when Elra said it made my chest feel strange. It was a gesture I recognized immediately. In every culture I had ever studied, across every civilization humanity had ever recorded, lowering your head to someone meant the same thing. It meant you owed them something you could not repay. 12,000 years of silence, and the first thing the galaxy said to me was sorry. I decided I very much needed to understand why. The Selena cord was larger than I had initially understood. What I thought was a small retrieval vessel turned out to be a craft roughly the length of a city block, with interior spaces that shifted and rearranged themselves with a soft mechanical sound that I eventually stopped noticing, the way you stop noticing traffic after you have lived in a city long enough. Elra gave me a room with a viewport that showed a slow, rotating view of omens and a sleeping surface that was not quite a bed, but was close enough that my body accepted it without complaint. They gave me 3 things on the first day. The water, a nutrient substance that tasted like nothing but felt like a full meal, and a small handheld device that gave me access to a curated portion of the conclave's translation archive. They did not give me access to the full archive. I noticed the gap immediately because there were clear, deliberate empty spaces in the record, sections that were labeled, dated, and then simply blank, like pages torn cleanly from a book. I spent the first night cataloging what I could see, which is what I do when I am frightened. I make lists. I take notes. I organize information into patterns, because patterns are something I can hold, and when I can hold something, I feel less like I am falling. What I found in the curated archive was this. The Galactic Conclave was not one species. It was an assembly of 63 species, some of whom had been spacefaring for millions of years, and some who had joined within the last few centuries. It had its own legal code, its own history, its own internal politics, and its own standing directives, which were laws so old and so fundamental that they had never been debated, only followed. There were 7 standing directives in total. The 7th one, the most recent, had been added 12,000 years ago. Its title, in the closest English translation I could construct from the archive's own notes, was The Ember Protocol. Beneath the title was a single line of explanatory text and then nothing. No supporting documents, no debate records. No names of the legislators who had drafted it. Just one line that my translation device rendered as, "The designated zone remains sealed until the conclave votes otherwise. Entry and exit are prohibited. All prior contact records are archived under maximum restriction." Maximum restriction. I wrote that phrase down 3 times, staring at it. Prior contact records. There were records. They existed somewhere in this archive, behind a wall I did not yet have the key to open. Records of what humanity had been like 12,000 years ago. Records of what had happened between us and the 63 species of the conclave. Records that explained why an entire galaxy had looked at one small blue world and agreed, unanimously, to wrap it in a force field and walk away. On the second morning, Elra came to see me. It arrived with 2 of the tall ones I had not seen before, different from the ones on my first day, and I began to understand that the seniors were rotating, that no individual was being asked to spend too much time near me. I filed that observation away without commenting on it. "I want to see the contact records," I said, before Elra had finished entering the room. "Good morning, Dr. Morrow. Good morning. I want to see the contact records." Elra set its translation device on the small ledge near the viewport and folded its hands in that prayer-like gesture. "That request has been forwarded to T-Council. It is being considered. How long will that take? Time is difficult to translate directly, but approximately 9 of your days." 9 days. I breathed out slowly. "Then while we wait, tell me what you can tell me without their approval. Tell me what you know personally." Elra was quiet for a moment. The 2 tall ones behind it stood with their hands at their sides, not in the prayer position which I was beginning to read as a sign of lower anxiety. "Progress. I know the broad record," Elra said carefully. "The details are restricted to me as well. But the broad record is taught to every conclave citizen from youth. It is part of our common history." "Then teach it to me." Elra sat, which was interesting because I had not been sure its legs bent that way. It sat cross-legged on the floor, which brought it to roughly my eye level as I sat on the sleeping surface, and it looked at me with all 4 of its amber eyes, and it said, "You must understand that what I am about to tell you may be difficult to receive." "I am an archaeologist," I said. "I have spent my career receiving difficult truths about civilizations that no longer exist. I can manage." "The civilizations I am about to describe do still exist," Elra said quietly. "That is precisely what made the decision so difficult." It began. 12,000 years ago the conclave was smaller, 41 species, not 63. Several of the current member species had not yet reached space, and several that had reached space were just beginning the long process of becoming part of something larger than themselves. The conclave was, by most measures, stable. It had its internal disagreements, its historical grievances, its philosophical divides, but it functioned, and it had been functioning in roughly the same way for several 100,000 years. Then, from a small yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, something started transmitting. Not a signal exactly, more like a pattern. A detectable signature in the electromagnetic spectrum that, when studied closely, resolved into something the conclave had never seen before. Not mathematics, not code. Something closer to what Elra called structured longing, which my translation device struggled with for several seconds before producing that phrase. And I got the sense it was the best approximation of something that did not translate cleanly. Several conclave species sent probes. The probes reported back. What they found was a world covered in a thin layer of carbon-based life, most of it unremarkable, but one species of it doing something that the probes could not initially categorize. Building, not in the way that animals build nests, but in the way that a civilization builds, with intention and repetition and improvement over time. Small structures first, then larger ones, then roads between them, then the early signs of agriculture. The conclave watched for 200 years before making contact. This, Elra told me, was standard protocol. You watch, you assess. You make sure the species you are about to introduce yourself to is stable enough to receive the introduction without shattering. 200 years of watching was considered generous but appropriate. The first contact team arrived in Earth's skies above what is now the Mediterranean Sea, at a point in human history that falls, by our calendar, roughly 10,000 years before the Common Era. They chose a small group of humans living near a river delta. They made themselves known slowly, over several seasons. They brought no weapons and asked for nothing. They observed the humans' language patterns and learned to approximate them. They offered small demonstrations of their technology, nothing overwhelming, just enough to establish credibility and shared understanding. The humans, Elra told me, were not afraid. Not for long, that was the first sign, Elra said. Every other species we had encountered at that developmental stage required years, sometimes generations, To move past the initial fear response. Your ancestors moved past it in weeks. Is that unusual? It is unprecedented. Elra paused. The contact team sent their reports back to the conclave. The reports were read with great interest. The conclave decided to expand contact. More teams. More locations. Over the next 200 years, 17 different species established contact points with human groups across your world. We were aware of all of it, I said. Yes and no. Individual groups knew what they encountered. But your world had no global communication at that stage. So 17 separate groups of humans were having 17 separate first contact experiences, and each group processed it differently, built different relationships, developed different outcomes. The conclave found this fascinating. We had never seen a species fragment first contact into 17 parallel experiments at once. I thought about the mythologies of early human civilizations, the sky beings in every ancient culture, the figures who came from the heavens and taught things, or simply appeared and were observed. I had always thought those stories were human imagination, pattern-seeking in thunder and starlight. I was revising that assessment rapidly. What went wrong? I asked, because something had clearly gone wrong. Elra turned one of its hands over in its lap, a gesture I did not yet have a read on. Nothing went wrong in the way you might expect. There was no conflict, no aggression from your ancestors, no disaster. What happened was subtler, and in the end far more alarming to the conclave than any outbreak of conflict would have been. It paused, and I noticed the two tall ones behind it had both shifted their weight at the same time, a small unconscious motion, like people tensing before something they do not want to hear repeated. The species that made contact with your ancestors began to change, Elra said. Not dramatically, not overnight, but over the span of 2 to 3 generations they began to behave differently. Their research priorities shifted, their philosophical frameworks developed new branches. In 2 cases, their population growth rates increased after centuries of stable numbers. In one case, a species that had maintained the same governmental structure for 40,000 years began, quietly, to ask questions about whether that structure was still the right one. I stared at Elra. You're saying we changed them. We are saying that contact with your ancestors introduced variables into 17 civilizations that those civilizations had not anticipated and could not easily reverse. The changes were not harmful in an obvious sense, but they were destabilizing, and the conclave is, above all else, an organization built on stability. So you cut contact. We debated for 100 years. Then we cut contact. Then we debated for another 300 years about whether that had been sufficient. Elra met my eyes with all 4 of its amber ones. It was not. Humanity without any contact from us continued to develop, faster than our models predicted, in directions our models had not accounted for. And the 17 civilizations that had made contact continued to change, slowly and steadily, in ways they traced, when they were honest with themselves, back to those first encounters with your species. What kind of changes? Elra was quiet for a long moment. The most common one, it finally said, was that they became dissatisfied. Species that had been content with what they had, with what they understood, with how they lived, began to feel that their contentment was somehow insufficient. They began to ask whether there were things they were missing, things worth pursuing they had never pursued because it had never occurred to them to try. Elra's voice through the translation device held something flat and strange that might have been sadness. For a civilization that has been stable for 100,000 years, that question is not a small thing. It is the first crack in a wall. I sat with this for a long time. Outside the viewport, the stars moved slowly past. There was no sound in the room except the faint mechanical breath of the ship. What you're describing, I said at last, is that humans are contagious. That is one way to say it, not contagious with a disease. Contagious with curiosity. Elra tilted its head. Contagious with hunger, it said. There is a difference. Curiosity can be satisfied. What your species carries is not satisfiable. It is not a question that wants an answer. It is an orientation toward the world, a permanent state of forward motion, a refusal to accept that what exists now is the final form of things. The translation device made a soft clicking sound, and Elra added something quietly. In our language, the closest phrase is the fire that does not know it can be put out. I thought about that phrase. I thought about every civilization on Earth I had ever studied, every one of which had been marked, fundamentally, by the refusal to stay still. We had moved out of forests and into plains, out of plains and into cities, out of cities and into skies, and when the skies ran out, we had built machines to take us to the edge of the darkness that surrounded our sealed-off little corner of the universe, and we had pushed against it until it gave way. I had spent my career being proud of that story. It had always seemed like the story of a species becoming itself. I was beginning to understand that from the outside, it looked like something else entirely. So the conclave sealed Earth away, I said, not to punish us, not because we had done anything wrong, but because the alternative was watching the entire galaxy catch fire. Elra looked at me carefully. That is not entirely inaccurate, it said. One of the tall ones behind Elra made a low sound. Elra answered it briefly, and then turned back to me. They are saying that you understand quickly. It told me. I am an archaeologist, I said again. Understanding things that happened a long time ago is what I do. Yes, but most archaeologists study what has already ended. Elra picked up its translation device and stood. What you are beginning to understand, Doctor. Morrow is a story that has not ended. It is, in fact, only now beginning again. It said that and then it left, and I sat in the blue-lit room with my notes and my lists and the slow-turning stars, and I thought about 12,000 years of silence, and the ember that the galaxy had so carefully tried to contain, and the fact that I was sitting here, on the other side of the seal, alive and breathing and asking questions. We had been locked away, and we had still managed eventually to get out. I should have felt small. I felt the opposite of small, which worried me far more than I expected it to. The Grand Archive was not a place I had been expecting to visit. When Elra told me, on the 9th day, that the Senior Council had approved a restricted access visit, I was already mentally preparing for a database. Something digital. Something I could scroll through on the handheld device they had given me. I was not prepared for what the archive actually was. It was a space station. Not a large one by the standards I had been developing since boarding the Selene Accord, but large by any human measure. It orbited a star that was technically dead, a white dwarf that gave off just enough residual light to make the station visible from a distance as a soft, pale shape against the dark. We docked at it with a series of gentle connections that I felt more than heard, and Elra walked me through a corridor that was different from anything on the retrieval vessel. Older. The walls here were a deep reddish-brown material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and there were markings on them that I recognized from my years of study as having been made by at least 9 different species, each in a different script, layered over each other across what must have been thousands of years of use. How old is this station, I asked. Older than your seal, Elra said. Older than most things we can reliably date, and it's been in continuous use continuously. Elra touched the wall as we passed, a brief, familiar gesture, like touching the doorframe of a home you grew up in. Every civilization that joins the conclave contributes to its record. Every civilization that leaves, voluntarily or otherwise, has its record archived here. How many have left? Elra did not answer immediately. Some questions are better answered by the archive than by me, it said. The access I had been given was restricted, but restricted within the archive still meant a space the size of a small museum, filled with reading alcoves and soft-lit displays and the kind of profound, heavy silence that only exists in places where a very large amount of very important information is being kept. I was given a guide, a young conclave archivist named something my translation device rendered as Kos, who was the most visibly nervous being I had yet encountered aboard any vessel. Kos had the same general body plan as Elra and the other conclave members I had met, but was clearly younger, and their 4 eyes moved in quick, darting patterns that reminded me of a student who has been told to supervise someone they are not qualified to supervise. They also, I noticed immediately, kept a consistent distance of approximately 2 full arm lengths between themselves and me at all times. I decided not to mention it. The restricted archive gave me access to 3 categories of records. The first was general conclave history, up to the period 12,000 years before present. The second was a curated selection of pre-seal contact records, with identifying information about human individuals and locations removed. The third was a set of records that had been described to me as outcome documentation, which I did not yet fully understand but intended to. I started with the contact records because they were the ones that mattered most immediately to me, as someone trying to understand what had actually happened between humanity and the galaxy. What I found there took me 2 full days to work through, and by the end of those 2 days I had covered 43 pages of notes on the recording device they had provided, and my hands were not entirely steady. The contact records were not what I had expected. I had expected something clinical, reports, observations, data tables. There was some of that. But most of what filled those records was something closer to correspondence, communications between contact teams and their home civilizations, written in a register that I could only describe as urgent, not panicked, but the kind of urgent that comes from people who are watching something they do not fully understand. and are trying very hard to communicate the texture of it to people who are not there. One report from a species called the Orith described an early human group they had been working with for 3 generations. The Orith had shared with this group a set of mathematical principles that, by their own account, took most newly contacted species somewhere between 200 and 500 years to fully absorb and begin applying. The human group had absorbed the basics within a single generation. Within 2 generations, they had begun sending back their own mathematical observations. Within 3 generations, they were proposing corrections to Orith theorems that the Orith had considered settled for 40,000 years. The Orith contact team's final report before the seal was implemented contained a line that I read 4 times. "We came to teach," the report said, in a translation that Koss told me was the most accurate available. "We have instead been students. We are not sure how to account for this in any framework we possess." The Veldin records were different. The Veldin were a gaseous species, which I had known in the abstract, but which became very real to me when I saw their script, a kind of pressure-sensitive impression on a material that looked like compressed fog. They had made contact with human groups in a coastal region of what I believed was the Eastern Mediterranean, and the initial reports from their contact team described a rich and mutually fascinating exchange of art, music, and philosophical tradition. The Veldan had a tradition of philosophical storytelling that was nearly 3 million years old, and they had shared several of their foundational narratives with the humans they worked with. The humans had listened with deep attention. They had asked questions. Then they had told their own stories in return. This is where the Veldan records became difficult to read. The stories that the humans told were not impressive by any technical standard. They were simple narratives about people facing difficult things and finding ways through them. They were about loss and endurance, about the desire to see what lay beyond the next hill or the next sea. By the Veldan's own assessment, they were philosophically unsophisticated, lacking the structural complexity of Veldan tradition. But the young Veldan who heard them could not stop thinking about them. The narratives introduced a concept that we do not have a clean word for. One Veldan archivist wrote, in a record that was dated roughly 500 years before the seal, a kind of personal urgency, the sense that one's own life is short, and that this shortness is not a tragedy to be mourned but an engine to be used. Our philosophy has always held that time is abundant. We have lived for millions of years as a species, and our individuals live for centuries. The human stories assume the opposite. They assume that time is scarce, and that this scarcity gives everything a weight that abundance cannot replicate. Within 2 generations, the record continued. Young Veldan have begun speaking about their lives in terms we have never used before. They speak of what they want to accomplish, not in the communal sense, but in the personal sense. This is a change in our fundamental social grammar. We do not know how to address it. I set the record down and looked at Koss, who had been standing at their careful distance of 2 arm lengths, pretending to examine a display on the opposite wall. "The Veldan," I said. "What happened to them?" Koss turned slowly. "They are a current member species of the conclave. They are well. But they changed. All things change. You know what I mean." Koss was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "They are not the same species they were before contact with your ancestors. Their social structure is different. Their philosophy is different. They live differently, individually, with more emphasis on personal development and personal accomplishment than any prior recorded generation. They are successful. They are, by most measures, thriving." Koss paused. "They also sometimes say that they do not know who they would have been without the contact, whether what they gained was worth what they lost. What did they lose?" "A certain peace," Koss said quietly. "The kind of peace that comes from not wanting more than you have." I sat with that for a long time. Then I opened the Shahari records. The Shahari were the ones that undid me. They were described in their own records as near immortal, though that was a simplification. They did not age in any way that any conclave species had been able to measure. They were composed of a dense, mineral structure that was technically stone, though a stone that had achieved biological organization over a time span that most other species could not easily imagine. The youngest Shahari currently alive had been present for the formation of the conclave itself, hundreds of thousands of years before. The oldest ones were not certain how old they were, because their memory systems worked differently than any organic species, storing information in geological layers rather than neurological ones. They had watched the early contact with humanity from a deliberate distance. The Shahari did not make first contact with anyone. They observed, they considered, and sometimes, after a very long time, They introduced themselves to civilizations they found worth knowing. They introduced themselves to humanity by sitting, as a single giant stone figure, on a hillside in what I believed was the Indus Valley region for approximately 40 years. Just sitting, not moving, not speaking. Humans came to look at them. Humans brought their children to look at them. Humans began leaving things nearby, food and flowers and small-made objects, as offerings or gifts or perhaps simply as experiments to see what would happen. Nothing happened for 40 years. Then one day a child, a girl of perhaps 6 or 7 years, walked up to the Shahari and put both of her hands flat against their surface and said something. The Shahari record of this moment was one of the most extraordinary things I had ever read in my career, and I have spent my career reading extraordinary things. She said, the record translated. She asked me if I was lonely, not if I was alive, not if I was frightening. She asked if I was lonely. She had clearly decided that I was a being who could feel things, and that I had been sitting on that hillside for a very long time, and that a being who could feel things and had been alone for a very long time might be lonely. She was the first individual of any species to ask me this question. I had been alive for what your people would call 800,000 years, and I had never been asked if I was lonely. The Shahari then described, in careful measured terms that still somehow managed to feel raw, what the following years were like, how they began to speak slowly, in the language of the people near them, how those people began to speak back, how they discovered, for the first time in their incredibly long existence, the particular texture of a conversation with a being whose life would end before the conversation was fully complete, how they found this unexpectedly, devastating and beautiful in equal measure. I had not thought about mortality for 300,000 years, the Shahari wrote. I had resolved it philosophically to my own satisfaction. Death was a thing that happened to other species. It was not a problem for me. It was barely a concept. Then I began to know these people, and they began to know me, and I watched the girl who asked if I was lonely grow into an old woman, and I sat with her when she was dying, and she held her hand against my surface the same way she had when she was 6, and she was not afraid. She was not afraid of it at all. She told me that she had had a good life, and that there were things she wished she had done, but that this was all right, because the wishing felt like proof that she had cared about things. After she was gone, the record continued. I thought about what she said for 60 years. I did not move. I did not speak. I thought about a life that cares about things. I thought about what it means to want things so much that you can die wanting them and still feel it was worth it. And I found, at the end of 60 years, that I too wanted things I had never wanted before. Things I had no framework for wanting, and that this was the most disorienting experience of my 800,000-year existence. The Shahari had been one of the primary architects of the seal. I read their contribution to the Ember Protocol records, buried in the archive documents, and it was not what I expected. They had not advocated for the seal out of fear of what humanity might do to others. They had advocated for it out of fear of what continued contact would do to themselves. We cannot permit this to continue, their representative had said, in the conclave sessions that voted on the seal, 12,000 years ago. Not because they are dangerous, but because we are not strong enough. We have endured for longer than any other species in this assembly, and we have done so by becoming what we are. Stable, resolved, complete. 1 century of contact with these beings has made us incomplete again, and we do not know how to bear it. We cannot bear to lose what we have not yet done. That is what they have given us. That is what we must close the door against. The seal passed with every single vote in favor. 63 species, reaching across the stars to lock one small world away. Not because that world had threatened them, but because it had reminded them of something they had been very carefully trying to forget. The feeling of not yet. The feeling of more. The feeling of standing on the edge of something unknown and choosing to step forward rather than back. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy, or threatened it, or harmed it. We had simply made the galaxy feel alive again, and the galaxy had found that unbearable. I closed the last record and sat in the quiet of the archive for a very long time. Koss came to stand nearby at their 2-arm-length distance. Are you all right, Dr. Morrow? They asked. I thought about 63 species, all of them afraid of a single ordinary question asked by a child on a hillside. Are you lonely? I thought about a stone being 800,000 years old, sitting with a dying woman whose whole life had lasted less than a century, being changed by it forever. I thought about what it meant that the galaxy had decided we were too much to be near. I have one more question, I said. I will answer if I am permitted to, Koss said carefully. The 3 species that established the deepest contact with us, the Orith, the Velden, the Shahari, Are any of their representatives at the conclave station we're heading to? Cops was very still for a moment. Yes, they said. All three requested to be present when you arrived. They have been waiting for several of your weeks. I looked at the wall of records around me. All those careful words. All those years of distance and containment and management. And on the other side of it, 3 civilizations that had known us, changed because of us, and then spent 12,000 years wondering what had become of us. Tell them I want to meet them, I said. Koss nodded once. Then they did something I had not seen any conclave member do before. They smiled. It was not a human smile exactly. The muscles involved were different, but the intent was unmistakable. They know, Koss said. They have been hoping you would say that since the moment we pulled you aboard. The conclave station was not one structure. It was a cluster of 17 interconnected platforms, each built by a different species in a different era, linked by corridors and bridges and open connecting spaces that made the whole thing feel less like a building, and more like a city that had been assembled by a very large committee over a very long time, which was, Elra told me during our approach, exactly what it was. I arrived by way of a transit pod, a small sealed capsules that moved through the station's internal network at a speed that made my ears ache. Elra accompanied me. 2 senior members of the Accord's crew accompanied Elra, and trailing behind all of us, at their characteristic 2-arm-length distance, were 2 additional conclave officials, whose function I had not yet been able to determine. The meeting with the witnesses was not held in a conference room, which I had expected, or a formal chamber, which I had also expected. It was held in an open space on the station's 7th platform, a wide circular area with no walls, only low railings at its edges, and a transparent floor through which I could see the Wawaitor burning far below. Someone had placed 3 large forms in the space, one for each waiting delegation, and a single standard seat for me, positioned at the center so that all 3 groups were equidistant. I was early. I sat in my seat and waited, and I was aware of Elra and the 2 escorts settling in behind me at a respectful distance, and I noticed that every conclave official visible in the surrounding corridors had stopped what they were doing and was watching. The Orith arrived first. There were 4 of them, insectoid in a way that was more mechanical than biological to my initial eye, their limbs jointed at multiple angles, their bodies enclosed in a structured casing that was either natural or worn. I could not immediately tell. They arranged themselves in a formal cluster and regarded me with eyes that processed information. I would later learn, in a frequency range significantly different from my own, which meant that what they saw when they looked at me was different from what I saw when I looked at them in ways I could not easily quantify. Their representative made a sound that my translation device caught and rendered after a 2-second delay. We have reviewed every record of your species that we possess. We know a great deal about you, and yet we know nothing about what you became after the seal. This is a peculiar position to occupy. I understand, I said. I was in a similar position 20 minutes ago before I finished reading your archive. A ripple went through the Orith cluster. Surprise? I thought. You read our contribution to the record? Their representative asked. I read everything I was permitted to read. Your mathematical records were my first stop. Your contact team's final report before the seal was particularly interesting. Another ripple. Longer this time. What do you mean by particularly interesting? You came to teach, I said, quoting the record back to them. You found yourself being taught instead. I thought that was an honest assessment. The Orith representative was quiet for a long moment. Then they said something that the translation device took an unusually long time to render. When it finally produced the words, they were, we have spent 12,000 years debating whether we learned something valuable from your ancestors, or whether we were merely humbled by them. We have not resolved this debate. We had hoped your arrival might help us. I'll do my best, I said, and meant it. The Veldan arrived next, and I confessed that I was not prepared for them. I had known intellectually that they were a gaseous species, but the reality of a being composed of light-refracting cloud, contained within a field that gave them a defined shape but let you see through them, to the star below, was different from any intellectual preparation. They were beautiful, in the way that certain natural phenomena are beautiful, the way a storm front is beautiful when you are watching it from a safe distance. Their representative did not speak at first. They simply regarded me with the sensory organs that served them as eyes, which were denser regions in their cloudy structure, darker than the rest, and I had the strong impression of being examined in a way that went beyond the visual. You are smaller than I expected, they said at last, through the translation device. I get that a lot, I said. The Veldan's form shifted slightly, a motion that Elra later told me was the equivalent of a laugh. Your ancestors were also smaller than we expected. We had extrapolated a great deal from their cultural output. The objects they made, the structures they built, the sounds they produced, all of it suggested a scale of being that did not match what we found when we actually met them. They were small and fast and enormously loud in ways that had nothing to do with volume. Loud how? Present, the Veldon said. Insistently present. When your ancestors were in a room, the room was about them, not because they demanded it, but because they engaged with everything in it so completely that everything else became context. We spent 3 generations studying this effect before we understood it. A pause. We then spent 3 more generations trying not to be influenced by it. We failed. The third group took longer to arrive. I heard the Shahari before I saw them, a deep, resonant sound that moved through the transparent floor and up through my chair and into my bones. Not unpleasant, but undeniable. The sound of something very dense moving through a space not quite large enough for it. Then they were there, entering through a wider corridor than the others had used. A shape that was roughly humanoid in the way that a cliff face is roughly humanoid if you tilt your head and allow yourself some imaginative latitude. Large, ancient-looking in a way that had nothing to do with wear or damage and everything to do with presence. The kind of presence that makes you aware of time in a physical way, aware that you are a brief thing in a long universe. Their representative did not use the translation device at first. They simply stood and looked at me, and the lookings took a long time. Long enough that I had time to notice that the watching officials in the surrounding corridors had all gone very still, and that Elra behind me had made a quiet sound that I interpreted as involuntary. Then the Shahari spoke, and my translation device rendered it as, "Hello, small one." I recognized the rhythm of that phrase from the archive. It was what the Shahari had said to the child on the hillside, in the earliest record of their contact with humanity. "Hello, small one." She had said hello back and asked if they were lonely. I understood then that they had done this deliberately. "Hello," I said. "Are you lonely?" The sound that came from the Shahari then was not translatable. My device made 3 attempts and then went silent, producing nothing. But I did not need a translation. The sound moved through the floor and the chair, and into my chest the same way the first sound had, and it felt, for reasons I could not explain to anyone's satisfaction, like an answer. Like the answer that had been sitting inside that archive for 12,000 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question again. The Orith representative leaned forward. "What did they say?" "The device didn't catch it," I said. "No," the Orith agreed. "It rarely does. The Shahari communicate in frequencies that most translation systems cannot fully process. What they said when it translates approximately is," and here they paused for a long moment, and I noticed all 4 of their eyes focus in a way I had not seen before. "Yes, we have been very lonely, and yes, we are glad you are here." I looked at the 3 species arranged before me, at the Orith with their 12,000-year debate still unresolved, at the Veldan who had lost a piece they did not ask to lose, at the Shahari who had sat for 60 years on a hillside processing the words of a dying woman who was not afraid. I thought about what each of them had given up, and what each of them had received, and whether those things balanced, and whether balance was even the right metric. "I have questions for all of you," I said. "A lot of questions, and I have a feeling that you have been waiting 12,000 years for someone to ask them." The Veldon's form brightened slightly. The Orith cluster made a sound that the translation device rendered as confirmation. The Shahari did not move, but the resonance in the floor changed in a way that I had already, in the space of a few minutes, learned to read. All 3, in their entirely different ways, said yes. I opened my recording device, and here is what I learned. The Orith told me that after the seal went up, they had gathered every piece of work that had passed between their contact team and the human group they had worked with. Every correction, every proposed theorem, every question and answer, and had put it into a separate archive of its own, which they called, in translation, the incomplete record. Not because it was unfinished, but because every time a new generation of Orith mathematicians studied it, they found something new in it that the previous generation had missed. The record had been in continuous active study for 12,000 years. It had produced 14 distinct new branches of Orith mathematics, 3 of which had become foundational to conclave science. When I asked if they had credited the human source material, the Orith representative was quiet for a moment that felt heavy with something. "No," they said at last, "we did not, because the protocol forbade discussion of the contact, so for 12,000 years, our science has built on a foundation that it does not name. We are aware of the irony." I asked the Veldan what had happened to the generations that had come after the contact. the ones who had first developed what the Veldan archives called the contamination of longing. They thrived, the Veldan representative said, in ways that made the older generations deeply uncomfortable. They formed the first Veldan artistic tradition that was not communal, individual creative work, signed by a single maker, offered to the public as something personal. It was considered strange for several generations. Now it is the dominant form of Veldan expression. Our children grow up expecting to make things that are theirs, specifically, and to have those things matter because of who made them. Do you think that's a loss? I asked. I think it is a change, the Veldan said carefully. Whether it is a loss depends on what you value. Those who value the old ways call it a loss. Those who grew up in the new ways call it a liberation. We have not yet reached a consensus, and we have had 12,000 years to try. The Shahari took longest. Not because they were reluctant to answer, but because everything they said required careful translation by a team of 3 conclave linguists who worked in real time alongside us, and because what they said was, even with that careful translation, sometimes very difficult to understand, not because the words were obscure but because the concepts were enormous. They told me about watching humanity through the seal. I had not known this was possible. I had assumed the seal blocked all transmission in both directions. But the Shahari had an ability that no other conclave species possessed. The capacity to perceive things at a distance through geological resonance, through the slow vibration of matter, at a scale that most instruments could not detect. They had been monitoring Earth not through the seal but through it. The way sound travels through a wall, muffled and incomplete but present. They had not watched everything. The resolution, as they described it, was too low for fine detail, but they had a record of broad patterns, the rise and fall of civilizations, the expansion and contraction of populations, the rhythm of construction and destruction and construction again. They could not hear words or see faces, but they could feel the weight of a species, the mass of it, the motion of it, and over 12,000 years they had learned to read that weight the way a geologist reads rock strata. You collapsed 17 times, the Shahari said, through the translation team. Each collapse was total enough that, had you been any other species, we would have classified you as extinct, and each time you rebuilt. What did it feel like from the outside? I asked. Like watching a fire go out, the Shasri said, and then watching it come back. And the thing that always struck us was that the fire that came back was never smaller. It was always larger, as if the going out was not a diminishment but a compression, as if you were not dying but preparing. The Shahari were quiet for a moment. Then they added something that the translation team conveyed very carefully, with the same precision you would use to carry something fragile. We have a word for this in our language. The closest rendering in yours is something like the fire that feeds on its own ash. We coined this word 12,000 years ago, after the seal went up. We coined it because of you. It is now the most commonly used word in our philosophical tradition. We use it to describe any process that becomes stronger through loss. We use it to describe resilience, creativity, the survival of meaning through change. You named a concept after us, I said. We named a concept because of you, the Shahari said. There is a difference. The concept was always real. You were the first example we witnessed at a scale large enough to see. I sat in that open, railing-edged space with the dead star burning below and 3 ancient civilizations arranged around me, and I thought about 17 collapses and 17 rebuildings, about the incomplete record that had produced 14 branches of mathematics, about the Veldan children who grew up making things that were theirs, about a stone being sitting for 60 years, thinking about a woman who had not been afraid to die. I thought about all of it, and then I thought about the fact that while I had been sitting here, reading records and meeting witnesses, and beginning to understand the shape of 12,000 years of careful distance, back home on the other side of the seal, 7 billion human beings had no idea any of this existed. They thought they were alone in the universe, and they were building ships anyway, because we always do. I found out about the breach on a Tuesday morning by the Conclave's timekeeping system, which was not a Tuesday morning by any measure. Earth would recognize, but which felt like a Tuesday morning, because I had been on the station for long enough that my body had developed its own rhythms. I was eating the nutrition substance that had gradually become almost palatable, and Elra came into my room moving faster than I had ever seen it move. Something has happened, it said, and its translation device's voice was flat in a way that told me the flatness was deliberate. Something good or something bad, I asked. That depends very much on who you ask. The emergency session of the Conclave Senior Council was not a meeting I was supposed to be present for. I was not a member of the Conclave. I was not a representative of anything. I was a xenoarchaeologist from a sealed world who had crashed through a 12,000-year-old barrier in a modified research capsule, and technically my status within conclave law was something that had not been formally defined yet, which Elra had described to me on my third day as an interesting legal situation, and which I had privately described to myself using less polite terms. But Elra brought me to the council chamber anyway, not inside it but to a room adjacent to it with a transparent wall, and stood beside me while the council assembled and said quietly, "You should see this." What I saw was 63 species represented by delegates, arranged in a circular space of considerable size, all of them displaying, in their various physiological ways, various degrees of controlled agitation. Elra's translation device had a range limit, and from our position, I could only catch fragments of the formal proceedings. But the fragments were enough. I was not the first human to cross the seal. This was the piece of information that hit me first and hit me hardest, not because it surprised me, exactly, but because the implications of it arrived all at once in a cascade that I was not entirely prepared for. I had assumed I was an anomaly. A single breach, a single incident that the conclave had responded to with the careful protocol of a system that had been designed for exactly this kind of thing. Retrieve, contain, assess, decide. But the council was not discussing a seal breach. It was discussing 17 different points on the seal's perimeter had been compromised in the past 10 years by 17 different human ships operating independently of each other. None of them aware that the others existed. None of them coordinated. All of them simply pushing in the direction that the evidence of their instruments suggested was the most interesting direction to push. One council member, speaking in a language that Elra translated in a low murmur beside me, said something that I immediately wrote down exactly as rendered. The seal held for 12,000 years. Their civilization has possessed faster-than-light capability for less than 50. In 50 years, they have found 17 separate weak points in a barrier that required the combined engineering capacity of the entire conclave to construct. There was a silence in the chamber after that. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of everyone in the room, processing the same information and arriving at the same conclusion, and not quite being willing to say it out loud. I said it out loud to Elra in a quiet voice. We did not break out because we are strong. We broke out because we got bored. Elra made the soft sound that I had learned to read as agreement. How is Earth? I asked. It was the first time I had asked that question directly. I had been careful about it. I had not wanted to appear desperate. There are ships broadcasting from 17 different breach points, Elra said. They are all transmitting on open frequencies. They are transmitting on all available frequencies simultaneously. The broadcasts are, according to our receiving teams, primarily composed of what appears to be a request. I already knew what the request was. I could have written it without being told. I had heard it in every story I had ever grown up with, in every impulse that had pushed a human being to the edge of any unknown thing. "Hello," I said. "Is anyone out there? We have been trying to reach you." "Yes," said Elra, almost exactly that. The council session ran for 3 days. I watched the first 12 hours of it through the transparent wall, sleeping in short intervals on the floor of the adjacent room because I refused to leave. The Orith delegates spent most of their session in a state of visible technical excitement, their limbs moving in quick patterns that their translator told me indicated rapid information processing. The Veldan delegates brightened and dimmed in ways that seemed to track closely with the emotional register of the discussion. The Shahari representative sat entirely still, as the Shahari always did, but the resonance in the floor around them was different from what I had felt before, not lower or higher exactly, but more complex, as if multiple frequencies were occurring simultaneously. The proposals under debate were, in summary, first, construct a new seal, stronger than the original, with redundant barriers to prevent further breach. Second, do nothing, and allow humanity to emerge naturally without intervention. Third, open formal diplomatic contact immediately. Each proposal had supporters. Each had serious objections. The debate was long and specific, and occasionally reached a pitch that suggested deep feeling, even through the formal structure. On the second day, a delegate from a species I had not encountered before, small and pale blue and moving with a liquid quality that I found deeply soothing to watch, made a point that my translation device caught clearly. We spent 12,000 years trying to decide what to do with a species we did not understand and could not control. We sealed them away. They built a civilization without us, developed technology without us, and found us anyway. The seal did not contain them. It contained us. It prevented us from making the choices that fear was pushing us toward. and it gave them the space to become whatever they were going to become without our interference. And now they are here. A pause. I would like to suggest that the seal did precisely what it was supposed to do, and that we have been wrong, for 12,000 years, about who it was built to protect. The chamber was very quiet after this, quieter than any silence I had heard since boarding the Accord. I heard it clearly through the transparent wall. On the third day, an emergency motion was called by the Shahari representative. They did not speak through a translation device. They spoke in their own frequency, through the floor of the chamber, and every delegate in the room felt it simultaneously. Elra translated it for me with a quietness that I recognized as reverence. The Shahari said, "We voted for the seal. All of those of us old enough to remember voted for it. We had reasons that seemed good to us at the time. We were afraid of what we were becoming. We wanted to preserve what we were. We believed that what we had was more important than what might come after. We were wrong. Not because what we had was not valuable, but because we confused preservation with life, and they are not the same thing. We have spent 12,000 years watching a sealed world go through 17 cycles of collapse and rebuilding without any help from us, and the watching has been the most instructive experience of our very long existence. We do not want to watch from behind a barrier anymore. We want to know them. We want to know what they became. We want to ask them things." Another pause, translated with such care that I felt each word separately. "We abstain. And in abstaining we ask Council to remember what it felt like. Before the seal, when the galaxy was still surprising, the vote was taken. 7 for resealing, 6 for open contact, 1 abstention, a tie, with 1 abstention meant by conclave law that the status quo was maintained. The seal would not be reconstructed. Formal contact would not be formally opened. But 17 breach points were already open, and 17 human ships were already transmitting into open space, and formal contact had, in a sense, already happened. In the person of one doctor, Kale Morrow, sitting on the floor of a room beside a transparent wall, eating a nutrient substance that no longer tasted like nothing, watching the galaxy try to decide what to do about the species it had spent 12,000 years trying to contain. I realized, sitting there, that I should send a message home. It took Elra 6 hours to arrange it. The message would be brief, compressed, transmitted through one of the open breach points by a conclave relay, and it would reach Earth in what my calculations suggested was approximately 3 weeks. I had to assume that whatever I said would be picked up by any number of institutions and agencies and individuals, and that it would need to be simple. I am alive. I am not alone. The universe is Fulcrum. That is what I sent. 4 sentences. I did not know, when I sent them, that by the time those words reached Earth, there would already be more than 300 human ships in transit toward the breach points, because we had been listening on every frequency for 60 years, and we had heard the faint echoes of 17 signals coming back toward us, and we had identified their origin points, and we had pointed ships in their direction the way water finds the lowest point in a slope, because that is what we do with openings. We go through them. When Elra told me how many ships were already in transit, I did the math in my head. 300 ships, minimum crew of 4, maximum of several hundred each, spread across 17 breach points, broadcasting on all frequencies. "They're going to hear us," I said. "They already have," Elra said. "The receiving teams have been monitoring the broadcasts. The primary content of the transmissions is music. Music. A significant portion of it, yes. Also mathematical sequences. Also what appears to be linguistic samples in multiple Earth languages. Also, in one transmission, what our cultural analysts believe may be recipes." I thought about that for a long moment. "That is the most human thing I have ever heard," I said. Elra made the small sound that meant agreement. "The council is reconvening tomorrow," it told me. "There is a new motion on the table. It was brought by the Orith delegation, who stayed up through the night reviewing the broadcast content." Elra paused. "They would like to know if the mathematical sequences in the transmissions are original to your current civilization, or derived from material shared with your ancestors before the seal." I looked at Elra. I looked at the chamber beyond the transparent wall, where delegates from 63 species were still milling in clusters, processing 3 days of debate. "Tell them to listen to the music first," I said. "They can argue about the math later." Elra relayed this message, and for the first time since I had met it, I saw Elra's 4 amber eyes hold something that was unmistakably delight. "They said yes," Elra told me. "They would like to hear the music." So I opened my transmission recording and I played it for them. A signal, compressed and slightly distorted by its journey through a breach point, from a ship that was probably halfway across the distance between Earth and the nearest breach point. broadcast on all frequencies, composed by a human being who had no idea that anyone out there would ever hear it. It was beautiful. Not because it was technically perfect. It was not. It was a little rough, a little uncertain in places, the way things are when someone is trying to reach across an enormous distance and is not sure if their voice is carrying. But it was trying. That was the thing. Every note of it was trying, reaching out into the silence and filling it with sound, not because the maker knew anyone was listening, but because the alternative was to say nothing, and saying nothing had never, in the entire history of our species, been something we were very good at. The chamber was very quiet when it ended. Then the Orith delegate made a sound that was not in their formal register, not a debate sound or a procedural sound, but something smaller and more personal. My translation device caught it as, oh, just that, one word. The sound of 12,000 years of distance collapsing into a moment of contact, again, for the first time or the last time, or perhaps simply the next time in a very long series of times that was only just beginning. I stood up. I walked to the transparent wall and I put my hand flat against it, the way a child had once put her hands flat against a stone face on a hillside, and I looked at the Shahari representative across the chamber, who had not moved in 3 days. They turned very slowly and looked back at me. Then, in a motion so deliberate that I had time to watch each part of it separately, they reached out one enormous, ancient hand and placed it against the wall from their side, not touching mine, the wall between us, but close. Hello, the gesture said, in a language that did not need translation. We've been waiting. The first human fleet arrived 7 weeks after my signal reached Earth. Not 300 ships. 612. The number had doubled in transit time as word spread and more ships diverted from their original courses to join the convoy, because when one human ship turns towards something interesting, every human ship within range wants to know what it found, and then it wants to follow. I watched them on the conclave station's long-range sensors, with Elra beside me and Kos beside Elra, and half the station's population arranged in the observation corridors in clusters that I had learned to read as agitation mixed with fascination. 612 ships was not, by the conclave standards, an impressive fleet. Some of their member species had defense forces in the thousands, but the human ships were broadcasting, all of them, all at once, on every available frequency, in 100 different languages, with 100 different kinds of content, and the combined signal was enormous, filling the receiving systems with more data than any arrival in conclave history had generated. The primary broadcast carried a simple message in 11 languages, cycling through them in rotation. The translation device I had been given rendered it cleanly, because by this point the conclave's translation teams had been working on Earth's language patterns for 7 weeks and were getting very good. The message said, "Hello, we are humanity. We know you are there. We have been looking for you for a very long time. We are not here to cause trouble. We are here because we have been alone for a very long time and we have a lot to share and a lot of questions, and we brought food in case you are hungry, which we understand you might not be, but we brought it anyway because it felt rude to show up empty-handed." This last part caused a significant stir in the conclave's cultural analysis teams, who spent 3 hours debating whether the food statement was literal, metaphorical, diplomatic, or some combination of all three. The Veldan delegate suggested quietly that it might simply be what it said it was, and that the appropriate response was to find out, and that perhaps the appropriate way to find out was to say hello back. The Veldan carried this point, which I thought was the right outcome. I was not present in the chamber when the formal response was drafted. I had been given a seat in the observation corridor with what I now thought of as my 3 groups, the Orith delegation, the Veldan representative, and the Shahari, all of whom had chosen to watch the arrival together in the same space, which Elra told me was itself historically unprecedented. Those 3 species had not occupied the same room voluntarily for several thousand years. The fleet held position outside the nearest breach point, waiting, not pushing through, not making demands, just present and broadcasting, filling the silence with signal the way we had always filled every silence we found. I looked at the 612 ships on the sensor display, and I thought about what they did not know. They did not know about the Seal's history. They did not know about the Orith's incomplete record or the Veldan's contamination of longing, or the Shahari sitting on a hillside for 40 years. They did not know that the galaxy had once found humanity so overwhelming that it had sealed us away, in our own solar system for 12,000 years. They knew one thing: there was something on the other side of a boundary, and it had answered, and they were here. That was enough for them. It had always been enough for us. The formal response from the conclave was drafted by a committee of 12, debated by the full council, revised 4 times, and finally approved in a vote of 51 to 12. It was transmitted in 11 of Earth's most widely spoken languages, and it was 3 sentences long. We receive you. We have been waiting. We have much to discuss. When the reply reached the fleet, the sensors lit up with a wave of signal so dense that the receiving teams had to manually reduce their sensitivity to avoid being overwhelmed. 612 ships broadcasting simultaneously. Music again in the first wave. Then voices, then inexplicably laughter, which the conclave's cultural teams logged as unidentified high-frequency vocalization, possible celebratory function, and which I did not bother to explain, because there was no explanation that would be better than just listening to it. The Shahari's resonance in the floor around me changed again, not to the complex layered frequency of the council session. Something simpler, something that, if I had to find a word for it, I would call warmth. I thought about what they had told me. 12,000 years of watching a sealed world go through 17 cycles of collapse and rebuilding. 12,000 years of feeling the weight of a species through the rock and resonance of space. Watching us compress and expand each time coming back larger, louder, more determined. I thought about what Elra had said to me on my very first day, when I was sitting in the blue-lit circular room with restraints on my wrists, trying to work out where I was. The ember must not spread, Elra said, the oldest active directive in conclave law, written 12,000 years ago, written because of us. I turned to Elra, who was standing at my shoulder. The protocol, I said, the ember protocol. Is it still technically active? Elra consulted something on the small device it always carried. Technically, yes. It has not been formally repealed. The vote on resealing failed, but the protocol itself was not struck from the record. So legally speaking, I said, the ember is still not supposed to spread. Elra looked at the sensor display. 612 ships. Music and voices and laughter filling every receiving system on the station. Legally speaking, Elra said, yes. We both looked at the display for a moment. How's that working out? I asked. Elra made a sound that my translation device had never encountered before. I looked at it. It was making the sound on its own, without any prompt, and it took me a moment to understand what I was hearing. Elra was laughing. It was not a human laugh. It was a clicking, resonant, harmonic sound that had no equivalent in any Earth language I could name. But the intent was unmistakable. The intent was the same thing that had been in those 612 signals. The same thing that had been in a child's hands flat against a stone face. The same thing that had been in the Velden's quiet account of young beings who started making things that were theirs and being glad about it. The intent was joy. Simple, unreserved, slightly ridiculous joy at the fact that something impossible had become possible, at the fact that 12,000 years of careful silence had ended in music and the offer of food, at the fact that the ember had spread after all, and the galaxy was not burning. It was, if anything, warmer than before. I put down my recording device and I looked at the sensor display and at the 3 ancient delegations around me and at Elra still making its clicking, harmonic, unprecedented sound, and I thought about all of it. The restraints on my wrists on day 1, the archive and its careful gaps, the Orith's debate and the Veldon's liberation and the Shahari's 12,000-year vigil. The vote that went 7 to 6 to 1, and the fleet that came anyway, because that is what we do with openings. We go through them. And on the other side, always, something has been waiting. 12,000 years is a long time to wait. But the conclave had waited. The Orith had kept their incomplete record. The Velden had kept their new tradition of personal making. The Shahari had kept their word for the fire that feeds on its own ash, and they had whispered it to each other across 100,000 years of slow stone memory, as a reminder that somewhere, in a sealed and silent corner of the galaxy, the fire was still burning. It was still burning. I walked to the viewport at the end of the observation corridor, and I pressed my hand against it, the way the Shahari had pressed their hand against the transparent wall, and I looked at the 612 ships holding position at the breach point. All of them bright with signal, and I felt something I had not felt since before I woke up in the circular room with the wrong restraints on my wrists. I felt like I was home. Not because this station was home, not because the conclave was home, but because home is not a place you find on a map. It is a quality of moment. It is the moment when you have been in the dark for a very long time and something answers. We had been in the dark for 12,000 years. Something had answered, and we had answered back. The music was still playing, on every frequency, out in the space beyond the seal. 612 ships full of human beings. who had gotten in their ships and pointed them at a signal they did not fully understand, because a signal in the silence is always worth following, and who were now waiting, patient and loud and full of questions, for whoever was out there to say something back. I thought about the Shahari's word, the fire that feeds on its own ash. 12,000 years of ash, 17 collapses, 17 rebuildings, and now this. I turned away from the viewport and picked up my recording device again, because there was work to do. There was so much work to do. 12,000 years of conclave history to begin to understand, 63 species to begin to know, an incomplete mathematical record that needed its source credited, a philosophical tradition built on a word coined because of us. Young Vuldan who made things that were theirs and did not know that a conversation between their ancestors and ours had made that possible. There was a galaxy out here. It was ancient and complex and sometimes afraid of us, and sometimes moved by us, and sometimes simply unable to look away from us. And we had not known it existed until very recently, and now we were here, loud and small and bringing food, and the galaxy was going to have to figure out what to do with us. I knew, already, how that would go. The same way it always went. The same way it had gone for 12,000 years of sealed, silent, ash-fed persistence. Badly at first, then better, then extraordinary. We were very good at extraordinary. We had been practicing for a long time. Outside, the music played on. 612 ships, full of human beings who had never met an alien, trying to say hello in every language they had, just in case one of them was the right one, just in case someone was listening. Someone was. The galaxy, old and careful and afraid and grateful and endlessly curious in spite of itself, was listening to every note. And somewhere in a deep archive on a station orbiting a dead star, in a file labeled Incomplete Record, the Orith mathematicians were already writing a new entry. The record, apparently, was still growing. I thought that was exactly right. I thought that was the only thing that ever mattered. The fire does not know it can be put out, and now the whole galaxy knows why.